This is October of 2021. We've just been through a period of very public hand wringing, regret, recrimination, shallow analysis of what went wrong with the United States of America in terms of the defeat in Afghanistan. And this came shortly after a long period of parallel introspection as to what had gone wrong in the American culture of policing. I say culture of policing advisedly, because there was no sincere interest in looking at, say, the constitutional principles that define policing, the legal principles, or nor even the actual training and education of policing. This was largely, reflected upon as a cultural issue that somehow Americans ought to be kind and good and loving towards one another. But a series of scandals in terms of police brutality and to some extent police corruption, police incompetence, revealed the extent to which culturally America has a problem with policing. Now, I'm insinuating that the problem is not merely cultural at all. And I see, in terms of the recrimination and reflection on the failure in Afghanistan, and now, just this last week, the recrimination and reflection on the apparent failure of the CIA. Explain a little more what I mean by that. I see this eagerness on the part of the American public to leap to a sort of cultural framing of the problem, rather than facing up to the extent to which the problems you're encountering, whether you think of them in terms of policing, in terms of the military, in terms of a unique institution like the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, instead of facing up to the extent to which those problems are the result of particular people who made particular decisions at particular moments in time, and indeed particular laws, particular principles set down in writing, which can include the Constitution, can include law in that most obvious sense. But sometimes it's in a somewhat more slippery form, such as a presidential directive, some written instructions, some written mandate or definition, especially for an institution like the CIA, for how the CIA is supposed to operate. Now, the questions we're dealing with here, I think the majority of my audience, frankly, is non-American. I think it is worth wondering, to what extent are these problems profoundly similar in England, in Australia, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, in Germany. Part of the pattern I see playing out is a very deep-seated assumption that we can understand political progress by looking at the leading edge of technology. And that by focusing on, optimistically, the extent to which the leading edge of technology is potentially or actually transforming our society, we can then infer from this a tremendous transformation throughout all other aspects of our society, right? So what do I mean? Well, for anyone who is my age, but even more so if you were 10 years older than me, 20 years older than me, 30 years older than me, it's very easy to see how much the world has changed technologically since your own childhood. It's very easy to be optimistic about the extent to which culture and politics might be presumed to change, to either have already changed or to be in the process of now profoundly changing because of that kind of leading edge progress. The work done by doctors in hospitals, the work done by a family doctor, not in a hospital, in a doctor's office or making house calls, how much has it changed really in 50 years? It's very easy to be optimistic and have this technology-centered view of medicine and of the role of government in medicine and the role of the patients in medicine, like, the actual sick people. It's very easy to look at it and think, oh, well, we've discovered MRI scanning. We know of these advanced computer forms of, scanning images that show us with this tremendous precision exactly where the cancer is in your body. And you can make a kind of false inference from this that therefore the role and responsibility of the doctor has changed, or that it is changing, or it's about to change, in relation to the patient, in relation to illness, and in relation to the role of government in providing money and certain kinds of legal strictures that define, medical institutions providing this kind of care for the public. The vast majority of what doctors do, what they need to do, what they actually do in medicine, it hasn't changed technologically, and it's not going to change. What really matters for doctors and nurses today is the same as what mattered 50 years ago, right? And you can discuss this culturally. You can express the underlying issues culturally. You can say, well, what you really need is a culture that produces caring, patient people who deal with the same problem again and again and again. Like, depending on which doctor you're talking to, where you can say, look, what do 90% of your cases boil down to? The vast majority of doctors, whether they're in an emergency room in a hospital or they're, a doctor in a small town where they provide all medical services for that small town, they are going to be able to list off just a few conditions that they get again and again and again. They work within a very small remit. And then if you look at what it is they're doing, again, kind of 5 days a week, what's their normal beat? And you ask them, well, how much has medicine changed in this field in the last 50 years? You may be surprised to find, that it hasn't changed at all. Now, on the other hand, of course, okay, so if we're talking about this culturally, medicine has changed tremendously, right? Culturally, right? Who are doctors? What kind of education do they have? What kind of ethical and moral outlook on the world do they have? That's changed tremendously. Right? I think we're going through a period of time in the United States of America, throughout the English-speaking world, i.e. even Australia and England, and I think throughout Western Europe, where we're quite reluctant to look at these problems, whether it's something as seemingly anodyne as the problem of the reform of healthcare, like how to improve the way medicine is practiced, questions of how to reform education, or, topics that are a little bit more menacing in their implications, like why did Western imperialism fail in Afghanistan? Because, by the way, it wasn't just a failure of the American military. Practically every, Western European ally of the United States of America got some blood on their hands, got some mud on their boots with this failed project in Afghanistan. The Italians were there, so on and so forth. Of course, the British and the Canadians, everyone threw in their lot with the American war effort. There's a tremendous reluctance to examine and evaluate these things in terms of the decisions made by particular people in positions of executive authority. Now, I ask you, if you have been reading the New York Times, as I have, I've been reading it on paper, terrible newspaper. Don't subscribe, don't pay for it. Terrible newspaper. I really don't recommend it. But if you've been reading the New York Times, you might stop and ask yourself, is there any other war in the history of the world that was remembered this way, that was reflected on and analyzed this way, where we look back at the events that happened without ever once saying there was this battle fought at this time with this general in charge or this commander in charge, and these were the decisions he made. I'd like to say he or she, but I think they're all male still to this day. But anyway, these decisions that he or she made, and where you're looking at the war battle by battle, executive decision by executive decision, right? And then looking at the outcomes. That's the way we talk about the history of the Napoleonic Wars, right? That's the way we talk about World War I and World War II, right? It is a history of executive decisions made by political leaders, people like presidents and prime ministers, and sometimes people like army generals, sometimes people like dictators. That's the way we teach and study and reflect on war. And when people ask, well, where did this go wrong? Why did this side lose, either the war as a whole or this battle or this chapter of the war, right? We look at particular decisions made by particular people. And then I think if you go deeper, the next step is, in plain English, to look at education. Now, I don't mean education in some kind of philosophically sophisticated sense that's difficult to explain, But even in reading about the history of the Napoleonic Wars, like why did Napoleon win? What was the advantage Napoleon's army had over other European armies and so on? A lot of it gets into immediately a discussion of education. You get into a discussion of the particular military colleges that produced Napoleon himself, the type of education that produced men working in artillery in the French military, the type of training that the French had at that time, how that's different from just one generation earlier in the French military, the question of the modernization and democratization of the French military, how that contrasted to earlier generations in France, how that contrasted to their close rivals like the Prussians, that's Prussian with a P, but also how it contrasted to the Russians with an R and the British. Even the discussions of like the British Navy at the time, what was the advantage the British Navy had over other navies? Very quickly, once you move past the level of executive decisions made by people in positions of power, army generals, presidents, prime ministers, sometimes dictators, queens and kings, then you get into the discussion of education, how education formed the competence and incompetence of the men fighting the war, how education formed the competence and incompetence of doctors and nurses, medical staff, right? You see where I'm going with this? In looking back at the year 2020, it seems so long ago, we have to look at how education formed the competence and incompetence of the police, right? Created the culture of unspeakable brutality, corruption, and frankly, just plain bumbling incompetence that the whole of the United States of America and the whole of the world was led to reflect on. And by the way, again, have to emphasize, this didn't just happen in America. I follow French politics. The same questions were unfolding in France. France had its own cases of police brutality. At least one of those cases was caught on videotape, maybe one or two. They mostly didn't have the same kind of lurid videotape evidence. But France, during exactly the same year, it was actually engaging into a similar kind of set of reflections on the competence and culture of policing in their country. My suggestion to you here is that this kind of peculiar technological optimism, a belief in a kind of progress that is partly unreal and partly real but irrelevant, has led us away from a sincere engagement with, one, executive decisions made by particular people that particular people will be responsible for, right, in the writing of history, and then two, a really sincere, in-depth engagement with these questions of education. Now, I defy you. Okay, the New York Times is many pages long. Every issue that comes out, I'm not reading this newspaper from cover to cover. I basically have been listening to kind of every major news podcast, not just from the New York Times, but from many other sources. I've been listening to a great deal of political radio while I'm in the gym doing my 200 push-ups. In all of the news coverage and political analysis that I've heard about the question of why did the United States lose the war in Afghanistan, I have never once heard the type of very simple factual analysis that you would presume by default to be offered, whether we're talking about Napoleon, World War I, or World War II. I don't think I've heard army generals named where they say, oh yeah, at this battle, this was the decision made by this army general, and this was the decision made by George W. Bush, and this was the decision made by Barack Obama. I don't think people are even aware of this. I don't think they're doing it as an intentional form of propaganda, right? But the war is talked about as if it's an entirely organic cultural phenomenon unfolding, as if it's like the popularity of yoga classes in California, right? That there was no central hierarchy or chain of command that made the decisions, right, that shaped the course of the war. And then I say the next step beyond this. So there's this really strange refusal to, it cannot possibly be that the New York Times wants to glorify George W. Bush. It can't be. That's not their bias here. I don't think the New York Times is even interested in glorifying the legacy of Barack Obama. I don't. It's very strange the way we've come to perceive politics and the way in which we've become willingly blind to politics, to the political history unfolding in our own times. That's what I see as the big issue here, right? And then I say the next step beyond talking about particular decisions, whether those are executive orders from the president, prime ministers of various countries, or generals, to then go beyond that and look seriously at who were the soldiers, who were the fighting men doing this, and in what way did their education prepare them or fail to prepare them for the ultimately cultural struggle of trying to transform Afghanistan from being the most backward, the most fundamentalist country throughout the Muslim world into being a modern cosmopolitan democracy, right? I mean, it's a huge challenge. I watched a documentary recently, maybe two weeks ago now, some of that. I watched a documentary recently that I had seen maybe 7 years or 10 years earlier about the war in Afghanistan. And the makers of this documentary, they of course they didn't know how the war was going to end. I think the documentary was made in 2011. Some of that they didn't see where this was going necessarily. And as with a lot of American sentimentality, it's showing the soldiers in what the filmmakers think of as a flattering light. It shows them palling around with each other, and it shows the kind of insouciance. I'm saying this in like a French insouciance, the kind of reckless silliness of youth, as these soldiers are palling around on the base and so on. And while I was watching this particular documentary, I'm noticing the patches on the arms of the uniform. I'm thinking, these guys, they can't be special forces. This can't be, the U.S. Ranger Corps, U.S. Army Ranger Corps. Like, can't be, like, I'm noticing the badges, and they're all wearing badges of like super elite special forces units. They're not general infantry. And apart from the documentary footage, they're having one-on-one interviews with these guys. And at the end, after watching the documentary, I looked it up. And to my amazement, these were not normal soldiers in the general infantry. These were super elite special forces guys. And you look at that. So like U.S. Army Ranger Corps, that is, I know this because I looked it up. That is a 61-day special training program. And it's hard to get into. You have to compete to get into this training program. Okay, what do you think they learned in those 61 days? To my knowledge, that elite training program, it's 100% about the physical skills of how to use a rifle in a gunfight. And they pride themselves. They claim, U.S. Army Rangers, if you've got that badge, you are one of the greatest, most skilled, most highly trained people in the world for, for face-to-face, rifle-to-rifle gunfighting, for that particular type of combat, that you're the best in the world. Well, okay, so these people were highly trained. I mean, everybody who was deployed in this particular documentary, in this particular valley where these particular battles were unfolding, everyone was highly educated. Everyone was highly trained. But we can recognize at the same time that the education they've received was irrelevant, totally irrelevant to the real challenge of transforming Afghanistan from being America's greatest enemy to America's ally. Transforming Afghanistan from being culturally, the home of the Taliban, to being a 21st century cosmopolitan modern democracy. They obviously, the most obvious thing is they lacked the language ability. They lacked any ability to speak any local language, these people. Obviously, they lacked the cultural sophistication, strategic sophistication, the public relations element. This documentary, most of the documentaries show that. It shows the commanding officer sitting down and talking to senior leaders in the village, or villages, plural, guys who are basically senior Taliban representatives, them handing out candy to people after they've just massacred innocent women and children and stuff, and doing the kind of public relations. And you can see, these guys, they kind of have an attitude towards politics like they're a high school gym coach, like they're encouraging football players on a team. Like, that's the way they talk. It's like, dude, you really have no idea what's going on here. You have no idea that you're making things worse when you imagine you're making things better. You're making it worse for your own soldiers, for the Americans, and you're making it worse for the local people, and you're exacerbating this conflict instead of actually resolving it. And, what was the world's easiest war to win became an unwinnable war. How? Through two factors: through particular decisions made by particular people in positions of authority, basically the President of the United States and a very small number of people who were selected by the President of the United States and worked very closely with the President of the United States and made some decisions normally being okayed by the President. But, we're basically talking about decisions made by a very small number of people at a very elite level. Those decisions were wrong. They were the wrong decisions. And what everyone should be saying, including the New York Times, what everyone should be doing is really examining those decisions, the strategic decisions, and really examining the legal and ultimately constitutional structure of authority, of how it is that wars are managed the way they are in the United States of America, which is, it's ridiculous, of course. The way the American empire operates, the role of Congress, the role of the Senate, and the role of the executive office of the president, and then how that relates to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and military structure. There are many, many ways in which you can offer a kind of systemic analysis of what's wrong and why in this sense, the United States lost the war in Afghanistan. I have not seen one column inch of the New York Times. I've not seen any article in any newspaper. I have not heard one podcast, one radio broadcast, or one television broadcast looking at it this way, right? There's a really strange fatalism to the way politics is viewed in our times. And the same fatalism is demonstrated when people are examining what's wrong with the healthcare system and what's wrong with policing, right? And then beyond that, right, there's no willingness to really look at education and the way in which education is producing competence and incompetence. And I just want to say, sorry, I do see your comments coming in the audience, guys. If we started from a blank sheet of paper and we were asking ourselves, okay, what kind of people do we need if we're going to conquer Afghanistan and profoundly culturally transform the place, get the local people on our side, transform it from being a Taliban-dominated society in which the vast majority of people, if they are not Taliban supporters, they are supporters of a traditional fundamentalist form of Islam that's about 80% as extreme as the Taliban. Because I recognize not everyone in Afghanistan supported the Taliban, but the quote-unquote moderate Muslims in Afghanistan, they were still more extreme than, say, the average Muslim in Iran. Really, Iran is not, it was never as extremely Muslim as Afghanistan. It's tough contrast to offer, but, before September 11th, 2001, the form of Islam prevalent in Afghanistan was so fundamentalist and so extreme that Saudi Arabia seemed liberal by contrast. Iran seemed liberal by contrast. Obviously, places like Malaysia and Indonesia. Okay, that's your starting point. What kind of training would you need to provide people with? What kind of education? What kind of person is going to do that job well? And here's my point. Here's the leitmotif for this video. Here's the point I'm coming back to again and again. All right? Don't tell me in reply that it won't be a problem because now we've got drone strikes. Don't tell me that it won't be a problem because we've got satellite data. Don't tell me that we won't repeat what happened in the Vietnam War because we've got unmanned aerial vehicles, i.e. drone bombing, and satellite data and the internet and infrared technology. People don't want to face up to the extent to which war hasn't changed in 50 years, right? People don't want to face up to the extent to which medicine hasn't changed in 50 years. And obviously, I'm not trivializing the technological breakthroughs. Having MRI scans, just the use of computer imaging, real breakthroughs that have happened in medical science technology. It's great. It's great. But actually, most of the time, for most things that really matter, the question is, what kind of people are you training to be doctors? And what are their attitudes? And what is the overall legal and cultural framework or structure in which they practice medicine, right? Like, it makes a huge difference if you have people whose attitude is that they have more than $100,000 of debt from going to university to become a medical doctor, and they've got to make money as fast as possible to pay off that debt, and they want to be rich. Like if you live in a culture where people go into debt to become medical doctors and then regard the profession of medicine as a way to become rich as quickly as possible, right? If that's your culture, okay, you have problems that cannot be solved through new technology, through a better computer system for x-rays or MRI imaging, right? It cannot be solved through the development of better vitamin pills, a better pill to help with malaria. I mean, there's scientific progress happening in various fields, right? The real fundamental problem you're dealing with all the time, remains the same. Okay, think about the challenge the U.S. Army was facing in Afghanistan. And let's really think about the ways in which that challenge hasn't changed since Napoleon. It hasn't changed since World War I. It hasn't changed since World War II. And then let's think about just how poorly prepared the soldiers and the people and even the executives of the United States of America were at all levels. How it was that the easiest war to win in the history of the world became an unwinnable war for the United States of America. And it wasn't just the United States of America. Italy, France, Canada, England, everyone else jumped on the bandwagon, right? And all of them, thinkingly or unthinkingly, reproduced the defects of the American strategic approach to Afghanistan. So we got a big problem here, guys. We've got a problem that runs deep. And in my opinion, it is the same fundamental problem that makes it impossible for us to reform medicine, healthcare, makes it impossible for us to reform policing, right? This is the same problem that we see in the impossibility of reforming the military. Then what I'm going to go on to talk about here is specifically talking about the CIA, elite level international intelligence. Just reading your comments. So Atlanta Richard asks, or I interpret his name as Richard in Atlanta, quote, when will the West take accountability, responsibility, and consequence from the machinations of what we call democracy and its failure to be held to a democratic standard? Anyone here old enough to remember the year 2000? There is a documentary that is called Unprecedented, the 2000 presidential election. I'm just going to shout this out so you guys can find it. Documentary film. So I saw that such a long time ago. It was many, many girlfriends ago. For me, when I saw that film, it was quite boring because I already knew all of the political facts rehearsed in it, or whatever. Rehearsed may not be the best word, but all of the political facts discussed and analyzed and presented, and I was already really familiar with them. But my girlfriend, who was sitting next to me, was just shocked. She was just astonished watching this. I was like, yeah, didn't you know that? What have you been doing there? Why weren't you, why wouldn't you already know all this stuff? So it was quite an interesting memory for me watching that. But, so you're asking the question, why is there so little interest in democracies holding themselves to democratic standards? It's not just America. And my point here in alluding to this film, what happened when the president of the United States was elected by a fraudulent election? It was a tampered with, fraudulent, illegitimate election, specifically in the state of Florida. It wasn't the whole country coast to coast, but specifically in the state of Florida, right? That there was jiggery pokery in that election. It was an illegitimate election, the president of the United States. What happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. Now, look, France, the Yellow Vest movement, that is a really sincere, really important pro-democracy movement within a democracy. Taiwan has a bunch of interesting examples, including what's called the Sunflower Movement, and it went on to other forms, Sunflower Movement, student movement in Taiwan. There are some little indications that some people in democracies are interested in democracy. Not enough. I mean, it's really, obviously the whole world should be in the grip of a massive Yellow Vest movement, and to use the Taiwanese example, a massive Sunflower movement, until we have real democracy. But the vast majority of people don't care. And from my perspective, for someone of my generation, what happened in the year 2000. It's now 21 years ago. Oh, and really it's before that. So really it's more like 22 years ago. Because the period leading up to the election is part of the history. That's what I mean here. That really shows, how little people care about democracy in Western democratic countries. It's a huge problem. And I don't think it's getting better. I think it's getting worse over those 20 years. And I would say this also, sorry, I keep alluding to what you see in the newspapers, what you hear on radio and in podcasts, because I listen to the horrible podcast made by the New York Times. It's all garbage. I despise the New York Times. Do you see in those newspapers or hear in those podcasts anyone saying, wow, what the French have happening with the Yellow Vest movement, that's what we need here. We need people demanding direct democracy. Now, apart from the fact that there's no broad public interest, there's also no interest coming from kind of career authors, reporters, and intellectuals, right? There's no interest from elsewhere in the sort of amongst the political cognoscenti, the supposed leaders of opinion. So someone also comments, quote, I believe at least half of your audience are Americans. No, really the strength of this channel is in Europe. So kind of, I have to thank my audience for putting up with the extent to which I talk about American and Canadian politics. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think the reason why this channel is more successful in Europe than in America is because Europeans have a higher level of education. Why do so many Swedish people watch this channel? Swedish people and German people and Swiss people and stuff. English is not easy for them. Like I have people watching this with English as their second language. And, sadly, if you've spent some time in America, I think you would know very, very few Americans are at a level of education such that they can appreciate the nihilistic discussions of religion, politics, history, ethics that are found on this channel. So, despite the fact that the vast majority of my videos about politics are talking about uniquely political material, no, this channel is not successful and it's not popular in the United States of America, which obviously shows most of all just in the total number of viewers I have remaining so low, even during periods of time when I devoted myself to studying. I read and reviewed Bernie Sanders' own book while Bernie Sanders was debating with Joe Biden. That was the biggest story in the world. So there's very, very little intellectual depth to be swam in the American audience. And that's also why, by the way, my own hopes for changing the future of the United States of America, they tend towards wanting to do a project like making my own James Bond movie, making my own Batman movie, making my own Star Wars movie. And by the way, I don't mean literally a movie starring James Bond. My point is that in terms of changing American culture and American politics, I really look to the possibility of engaging with pop culture, with doing something creative that communicates the ethical and political point I want to make indirectly. I very much doubt I would actually make a movie starring the character James Bond, but you know what I mean? The point is, if you can take your message and express it in an action film, if you can take your philosophy, frankly, and make it meaningful to an audience in that kind of artistic and indirect way, that's the way I think to influence the future of the United States of America, and that's the future of democracy in the Western world. And there's a real need for it. I mean, you tell me whether you think of fiction or nonfiction. Is there any movie you can go out and watch right now that's going to give you a really meaningful set of reflections on what went wrong in Afghanistan? There should be 10. At the end of the Vietnam War, there was an avalanche of filmmaking, both fiction and nonfiction, right? Where I don't think there's anything mainstream, and I think if you look around at what's available in terms of small independent filmmaking, you're looking at little crumbs. There's really nothing terribly impressive in terms of cultural production. And by the way, I do think it's meaningful to have a response to what happened in Afghanistan that is as symbolic and as indirect as Star Wars. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying everything has to be a direct ham-fisted commentary. And by the way, George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, the author of his career very much started as writing science fiction responses to the war in Vietnam. And I feel even now as an old man, he's still wrestling with what went wrong in the Vietnam War, or what the significance of that period of politics is for his own life and for the United States of America. Yeah, so Junebug comments, this is interesting here. Quote, this reminds me of the conversations we're having now in the United Kingdom about how exactly and how well the police are vetted after a police officer has murdered a citizen. Hard examine on this issue now, I take it. In Canada and the United States, we are burdened with a very simple concept that England has not embraced yet, and that is equal protection under the law and equal benefit. That's such a simple principle, but it's very, very difficult to live up to, and England doesn't have that yet. I mean, England doesn't have any written constitution, right? There is no standard that anyone in the police or otherwise are held to in the United Kingdom. I was interested in police brutality, police corruption, police incompetence in England. And frankly, it's terrifying. I mean, this is one of the scariest countries to live in the world in terms of the relation between irresponsible authority and the hoi polloi. But to quote a punk band you might have heard of called the Sex Pistols, England is dreaming. So we have several people in the audience writing in to say they were too young to remember the year 2000. Well, I encourage you guys, Brendan and Junebug, take the time to watch that documentary. That'll probably mean a lot to you. And I think you will have childhood memories linked to what happened in the year 2000. But suddenly it'll start to make sense. And you'll realize the enormous significance of public indifference to that issue. I mean, there's the issue itself, and then there's public indifference to it. And again, let's be clear. This isn't just the United States of America. This matters in France. It matters in England. It matters in Germany. It matters in all of the connected political cultures around the world. And all those people recognize George W. Bush as the legitimately elected leader of the President of the United States when he was not. It wouldn't have taken a whole hell of a lot of backbone for Tony Blair to stand up and say, no, I do not recognize this man as the legitimately elected President of the United States. He could have engaged in moral grandstanding that way and say, look, America has a broken system of elections, and until you guys fix it, and you also have a corrupt Supreme Court. That was part of the drama of what happened. But yeah, this was in response to a question talking about democracies holding themselves to a standard of democracy, and thus democracies holding one another to a standard of democracy. Yeah, we got a lot of Swiss people in the audience. I alluded to that briefly before. And I think, I think this reflects that the Swiss have a high level of education. And thus, there are Swiss people. English is not really anyone's first language in Switzerland. But I have a significant Swiss audience nevertheless. And I do not have much of an audience in Atlanta, Georgia, in case you haven't heard. So on and so forth. Alexa, what's the time in Zurich?
In Zurich, it's 9:17 p.m.
Prime time in Zurich. It's a good time for me to be broadcasting from a Swiss perspective also. Okay, so let's talk about the CIA. Let's talk about intelligence. It's really saddening to me. I guess you could say intelligence and the CIA, it has never been my special area of study, but it intersects with and overlaps with each and every area of study I have been engaged with. The CIA is an important part of the history of Haiti. It's an important part of the history of the Sudan. It's an important part of the history of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, pretty much anything and everything I study. The currently unfolding conflict still in Syria, almost everything I have ever studied in politics, you have to deal with the question of what is the CIA attempting to do, and then what do they actually end up doing, and what did different presidents of the United States direct the CIA to do, and then maybe how did the CIA interpret that and carry it out? Because the CIA has they're given some liberty to show some initiative and take things in one direction or another. We're living through a month this month right now, October 2021, the New York Times is engaging in public hand wringing. They're wringing their hands over the question of whether or not the CIA has lost its edge, has lost its capacity. Whenever I read these articles or hear these podcasts or hear these news broadcasts on the radio, I hear a lot of radio via the internet, as alluded to. So it's a radio program, but repackaged as a podcast. Whenever I hear these sources, it's really shocking and saddening for me to see that I know much more about the CIA, what it is and what it isn't, than the people who are paid professional journalists who are supposed to be doing this job. That is very saddening for me. Now, I'm already accustomed to listening to the news about Cambodia and feeling that I know and understand much more about Cambodia than the journalists who are presenting this, in English. I listen to the news about Thailand, about Taiwan. Like, there are many places of the world and many kind of categories of political reporting where I've had to become resigned to the fact that if I listen to this, I'm going to be kind of heavily sighing and complaining, like, oh God, these people don't know what they're talking about. Or if I'm reading an article in the New York Times, these people don't know what they're writing about. But yes, it is especially saddening. It is especially demoralizing to see American journalists writing in English who know and understand so much less about the CIA, about the Central Intelligence Agency than I do, their past, present, and future importance. Okay, I'll just pause again now to look at your comments, guys. Yeah, Junebug comments that it's so annoying when people make a lot of noise in a protest and then forget about it, like it's nothing a short time later. Well, this is the end of the year 2021. How many of the issues of 2020 does anyone care about anymore? It's not so long ago. You can remember defund the police, et cetera, et cetera. You can remember these extreme demands for political reform, political change. But even going back just 1 year earlier than that, it seemed like everyone in the United States of America wanted to reform the healthcare system and wanted to reform the university system. I mean, it's a long time ago now, 2018, 2019. Remember when what everyone wanted to deal with was student debt, tuition, the cost of healthcare, right? Like and all of these things have disappeared. Things that that impact people's lives very directly and personally, and things that are far away, whether that's Afghanistan or what have you. So yeah, the fleeting and shallow nature of what little political engagement exists is also it's kind of dire warning about the state and future of democracy. And look, I can say the same about veganism. I can say the same about ecology. You can say the same about global warming from 1 month to the next kind of thing. These things come and go. None of them, as fashions, even endure as long as blue jeans. And it's very sad to think that for these people, they care less about democracy than they do about the latest style in blue jeans. Alexa, what's the time in Colorado?
In Colorado, it's 1:22 p.m.
Someone's eating their lunch in Colorado while watching this live. Good for you. So we're going through a brief period of time when the mainstream press is criticizing and cross-examining the CIA. Why? 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 For getting killed. What could be more surreal or bizarre than that? That the cause for concern, the cause for political controversy, is that a memo went out from the CIA, a memorandum, saying that a lot of their informants are being killed. Now, again, the fundamental problem here is a false model of progress based on technological innovation, based on an examination of the leading edge of technology and presuming that that makes other parts of the political, cultural, and educational infrastructure obsolete. And it doesn't. It's irrelevant. Okay. Oh, well, now we have email. Now we have satellites. Now we have surveillance cameras. Now we have all these high-tech innovations. Guess who's joined me? Hey, babe. I'm in the middle of live streaming. Yeah. In case you hadn't guessed. Okay. Naturally, there's a kind of optimism linked to this, that people think they'll change the world, that people think conventional intelligence work, conventional espionage is obsolete or can be neglected or can be forgotten about. And just as I've said before, that the most important thing in healthcare is not the leading edge of new scientific developments, what goes on in a laboratory or some new piece of high-tech equipment that's come out. But rather the question is the actual skill set, the quality of the people, not just in terms of their competence and education in that sense, but the quality of people ethically and in terms of their motivation, who are every day delivering babies, every day conducting pap smears, every day inspecting x-rays, every day giving people advice that they should quit smoking, eat a vegan diet, eat a healthier diet, and again and again and again. Like, if you're a medical doctor in the United States of America, what matters more, these kinds of technological innovations or having the skill set to really deal with the obesity epidemic or the skill set to really deal with the drug addiction epidemic, right? It's not high tech, it's low tech. It deals with, ethical problems and problems of personal motivation to a much greater extent than what's happening in the leading edge. Okay. What is intelligence work? What does it mean to be an asset or an informant for the CIA? Okay. Think about a hotel where there's one guy on the janitorial staff nobody really likes and nobody ever talks to. And everybody knows that he's an alcoholic. So sometimes he disappears for a few weeks at a time and nobody knows why and nobody asks. And if somebody is hired new to staff, say, hey, wait, what happened to that guy? Why didn't he show up for work today? People say, oh, yeah, that guy, don't worry about it. The boss, as some kind of favor to him or something, the boss keeps this old alcoholic around. He gives him a job here as a janitor. But when he doesn't show up for work, we just don't even bother complaining. That guy's a no-hoper. That guy, nobody pays attention to, has the key for every single room in the hotel. And sometimes there are important guests who stay in that hotel, politically important, strategically important. And sometimes he uses his key to go into that room and very carefully remove every document in their briefcase and photograph them all, and then put them back into the briefcase in the same order. And sometimes he takes a very small electronic listening device and inserts it into that person's briefcase so that when they go to their meeting, there's a device recording the conversation, sending it back to the CIA one way or the other. Okay? It's a thankless, humble task. And you know what? That guy nobody pays attention to, maybe once in a while he poisons somebody. Maybe once in a while he kills somebody. And nobody ever knows. That is what it is to be an intelligence asset, to be an informant. What is going to motivate this guy? And how are you going to reward this guy? You think it's money? Where do you think the hotel is that I'm describing to you right now, where this humble person is doing this humble work? And by the way, most likely the owner of the hotel is to some extent in on it to make this possible. Like maybe not. Maybe you've given the hotel owner a fake story. Maybe you've just bribed the hotel owner. You've taken him aside. You don't let him know it's an intelligence. You say, look, this is my uncle Charlie. He's an alcoholic. we're trying to get him. I know he's no good, but look, can we pay you to, can you keep him on staff, even though sometimes he disappears on a drinking bench? And by the way, my point is here, when this guy disappears, he's not going on a drinking bench. He's doing other kinds of operations that take him away for whatever period. He's disappearing and reappearing for other reasons. Right? What if the hotel I'm describing to you is in communist China? What if it's in Iran? Sooner or later, this guy gets caught. Sooner or later, he is tortured and then killed. That's the future he can look forward to as an intelligence asset for the CIA. What are you going to pay him? What are you going to pay him to do that job? And how is he ever even going to spend the money? Right? He's got to live that life. He's got to keep up that cover story. And you might say, oh, well, he could own a mansion somewhere else and have his wife and kids take it. No, he can't. I mean, the vast majority of people doing this, really, you can't. Think about the life he's got to lead, whether it goes on for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, right? And we've just had this kind of strange admission from the CIA that they have a problem because their people are getting killed, all right? If you own a mansion, there's a paper trail. If you have a wife and kids somewhere else who are being well taken care of, who are living in luxury while you're living in poverty as a janitor, part-time janitor at a hotel, okay, there's a paper trail. All right, there are signs for all this kind of thing. All right, that's the kind of person the CIA needs. Now, I have read and I have heard interviews with a great variety of people who were assets for the CIA at different levels, in different capacities and for different lengths of time. There are no interviews with the guys who died, with the guys who disappeared, right? The untold side of the story is this body count that's spread out all over the world. And, how much do you think technology has changed this in 50 years? They had little miniature cameras 50 years ago. They had little miniature listening devices. It was a little bit different, you know what I mean? But when you're at that level, that level of budget, when you have a multi-million-dollar budget, even 50 years ago, you'd be surprised just how good the surveillance equipment was. I mean, it's become cheaper, it's become optimized, and so on and so forth, I know. But still, the mechanics you're talking about here, right? And you're talking about people who have to have an ethical commitment to not switch sides, to not go over to working to the Chinese and handing you false intelligence, go over whatever the enemy state is, whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, whatever, right? You need people who are really sincerely committed to working for you and for this cause. And I'm not even saying even if it kills them. They have to be doing it with the awareness that sooner or later, eventually, it's going to kill them. So we're talking about a country in 2021 that is not capable of facing up to the kind of profound educational failure behind the failure of their healthcare system, hospitals, doctors, nurses, etc., right? The profound educational failure behind the incompetence of their police services, law and order. Well, it's the whole legal system, the court system, the lawyers, everything else, right? We're not capable of even thinking this way about the failure in Afghanistan. And, obviously it's not just Afghanistan. I think if you look at the failure in Iraq, it's a somewhat different failure. But, we have several failures connected to and overlapping with Afghanistan that we can hitch to this same wagon. And as I've said again, parallel to this, there's a refusal to think kind of honestly and clearly about executive decisions, because this just leads to a conclusion about whose fault is this? What exactly did George W. Bush decide? What exactly does the Constitution say? Where exactly did this go wrong? We don't want to look at, police departments and what they do, not just their training of police officers, but the actual, principle, like when do you choke someone if you're a police officer? We don't want to look at that. Oh yeah, that decision was made by one man. This guy on this date at this, he signed the order for when the police should use chokeholds. That's what it comes down to. And it might be the state governor, it might be the mayor, it might be, the captain of the police, the chief of police, wherever, it's the sheriff, depending on where you are. But particular people made particular decisions that had particular consequences. We don't think that way about politics at all. So now when we move into the category of black ops, of things that are genuinely secret, how much worse are these same problems, right? How much less capable are we of mentating, like just visualizing and thinking through the kind of competence we were supposed to be developing, how and why it is we fell short of it, right? How incapable are we of just even conceptualizing the problem, let alone moving toward a solution? So what do I actually hear from the New York Times? These are, I feel like the problem is that the United States is falling behind from the leading edge of spycraft. They use the word spycraft like 50 times, right? They want to talk about this as if it's the cell phone industry. Like, China is moving ahead in 5G cell phone technology. Is it 5G we're at now? Okay, 4G, 5G. I don't know. Is America falling behind in cell phones? Is China taking the lead in cell phones? They're talking in the same way that on a deep, unexamined level is technological about China racing ahead in spycraft, about Iran racing ahead in spycraft, right? They don't want to look at it educationally. They don't want to look at it at an executive level, executive decisions being made, like an actual plan or a law or a resolution or constitution or whatever, right? And they also don't want to look at it culturally. So I went to class one day at the University of Victoria, and it was a special class for trying to arrange an internship. So it wasn't the usual university class. And right at that time, I had been looking at getting a job in intelligence myself. So I could go on a long digression about this. So it is actually an interesting digression. I used to bitterly joke about this. There was a time when I went around and talked to like maybe 5 different university professors. Like this, if you did this like on Seinfeld, it would seem hilarious. Like living through it, you're like, is my life a situation comedy? I sat down with 5 different professors, 5 very different guys, all men, and said, look, this was what I wanted to do with my career, but now that the university has proven that it's broken, I can't do that. Like, what do you think I should do with my education and career? And all 5 of them told me to work for the CIA. And like, you're sitting there like, is it me? Like, is it something about me? Is it my swag? Is it my steez you're responding to? Like this guy, like this. And they knew me. They were not strangers. These professors, each of them had some level of knowledge of and appreciation of me. They'd worked with me for some time. Wasn't right at the beginning. You're like, is it me? Or do they say this to fucking everybody? You know what I mean? Is this like their normal go-to? Oh, you should work for the CIA, right? And I just put in a footnote. Some of them just immediately said CIA for me, but some of them said more broadly. And, they said, look, you should look at working for the Canadian military intelligence. You should look at this intelligence, like where they talked through several different careers in intelligence and spycraft, shall we say, with the CIA just being one of them on the spectrum. But some of them just said, oh, CIA, that's what you should do with your career. And it was about that time. This was fresh in my mind, this kind of surreal experience. And like, guys, I wasn't enrolled in espionage. That wasn't my major in university. You know what I mean? That's not what I signed up for, guys. This is what these professors are telling me. That's what a guy with my skill set should go into. You know what I mean? Well, I mean, now that I think about it, so yeah, it was a very strange and saddening time in my life. And you guys know I went through signing up to join the army and fight against ISIS. And I did look at signing up for several different armies. So I go to this one special class connected to getting an internship. And there is a girl there from Iran. I'm sorry, I'm saying girl. I should say young woman. She was wearing the full black smock, the full flowing gown of being an Orthodox Muslim. So I couldn't see much of her. And her voice was so immature that's why I think of her as a girl, not a woman, just her way of speaking. Now, I don't know her age. She was, I can't describe her aside from the fact that she's wearing this smock of being an Orthodox Muslim. I don't know what she looks like. I don't know anything about her. I don't know how old she is, but she sounded very immature. It's possible she's 25, but is a really immature 25, and it's possible she's 18. I don't know. Right? Anyway, I've been going through this, and she started talking and joking openly, kind of in front of everyone in the classroom. Like she wasn't speaking to me like I'm a close personal friend or something. She started talking about the fact that representatives from the government, so this was the government of Canada, but it's quite likely they were really the American government working hand in glove with the Canadian government. It's not worth my getting into how that happens. But some representatives of the government, either Canada or the United States or both, had approached her and tried to recruit her to be an intelligence asset in Iran. And she was talking about this in a girlish way. Oh, isn't this just the limit? Like that she would be this kind of spy. Anyway, I didn't interrupt her, but I went over to her because we were there for a couple hours. I went over to her some number of minutes later, and I said, look, I understand you're just laughing about it, but really, you should never discuss that openly this way. And you should be very careful what you say in email or Facebook messages. Because when you go back to Iran, the government of Iran will know that you had that meeting. They'll know, like, even if you think it's a joke and you'd never do it, right? They will know that you have been contacted, that you've been spoken to, and they'll know basically what you just said in this room now. And when you say that you just laughed at it, you weren't, they may not believe you. This is someone who may be imprisoned, tortured, and interrogated the next time they go back to Iran. And if you look at it from the perspective of the Iranian government, like in a perverse Machiavellian sense, can you blame them? They have a problem with Iranian citizens going over and living in Western countries, whether France, America, Canada, and coming back with political attitudes and an agenda and attachments to intelligence agencies and reporting, working as assets. And again, you could become a janitor in a hotel, right? It's not just scientists in a nuclear research facility, right? Because the point is, if you're a janitor in a hotel, sometimes scientists from a nuclear facility stay as a guest at that hotel, right? Like this is it throughout the whole of society. And this is the way intelligence work pervades the whole of society. Okay, but we're talking about ethics and motivation and education and culture. Think about how difficult it is for the Canadian government to find a young woman like that who is so profoundly Muslim, so Orthodox Muslim, so committed to their religion, that living here in Canada, she's still wearing the full black smock, which, like you have the right to do that here. Legally, you can, but very few people do. Like a lot of people, when they come over here, they start dressing like a Canadian. They start wearing, sorry, I shouldn't say like a Canadian. They start dressing like a Californian. Let's put it that way. They start wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt or whatever. Even if when they go back to visit their family in Iran, they then wear more conservative. So this is someone who is so deeply committed to Islam, fundamentalist, extremist Islam, let's put it that way, that's how they're living their life. And you think she is going to make a commitment to work for the Queen of England, to betray the people and government of Iran and inform and, again, do all the work of intelligence asset. She's going to do that for you with the knowledge that this will lead to, again, eventually her being tortured and executed, her being imprisoned, tortured, and executed, and quite likely her relatives, at least her relatives are taken in and interrogated. Quite likely her brothers or what have you, or her parents, other members of her family. Even if they're not tortured and executed, they will at least be imprisoned and interrogated and, everything's. You think that is her level of commitment to king and country, to the Queen of England, to Canadian democracy, the great inspiring ideal of Canadian democracy. How rare would that be? to find someone who can work that way for the CIA, making the transition from Canada to Iran. I can now say exactly the same shit to you about Chinese communism, right? We have all these Chinese coming here, and they come and they study in our universities. You think you can sit down with one of those people and you can turn them, you can get them to work for the CIA when they go back to China? And even if you think you can, the vast majority of those people, the minute you do it, they're going to contact the Chinese embassy, or they're going to contact one of the organs of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're going to say, "Hey, look, this is what the government of Canada or the CIA, the government of the States, wants me to do," and then they will become instantly a double agent, because the Chinese government will say, "Okay, just keep pretending like you're cool with that. Keep it going." That's what this is standard. Melissa is surprised. This is standard practice. They say, "Okay, we're going to give you some fake files you can share with them. Like, we're going to give you intelligence you can share with your CIA handler," or whatever the agency is. You can hand up the line. We're going to keep cultivating you as a false asset for the CIA. And again, it's not like opening a bakery. Okay, you open a bakery. Maybe it's going to fail and you go bankrupt. Maybe it's going to be a huge success. Maybe something else. You are engaging in a venture that inevitably ends with your death. And again, really serious consequences. Certainly in China, your whole extended family. If you become a CIA informant or asset in communist China, what's the consequence for your parents, your brothers and sisters, your children or grandchildren, if you have any? Where do you think that leads to for them? All right, they're on a list forever. And by the way, I do think the communist government of China, it's less brutal than the government of Saudi Arabia or Iran. I mean, it is, and to be fair, how do you think the government of the United States of America treats people who come to the United States to spy for Vladimir Putin? And it exists, and there are examples. It may be less brutal than some other countries, but there is some measure of brutality involved in this. Okay, and now let's flip that scenario around. You want to talk about motivation and ethics for people working in intelligence. How many people are there who go from Iran to the United States of America and are diehard, deeply loyal to Iran and will continue reporting to Iran and serving Iran for the rest of their lives? And it doesn't matter if you torture them. It doesn't. They believe. And I just point, when you talk about Iran, we're not even really talking about Islam. You're talking mostly about nationalism. There are very secular people in Iran. I'm not joking. There are people who are, kind of nominally Muslim. They're just barely, they're pretty secular modern people, but they are passionate nationalists. They support Iran as a nation state, going back to, the war with ancient Greece. They think of it as ancient Persia, all the way through their imaginary glorious future. There are people who are Iranian nationalists. And then, of course, in addition to that, there are Muslim fundamentalists who see Iran as the, unique bastion of the one true form of their religion that they're willing to fight over. You think that's hard to find? Like, think about which one is scarce. And now let's think about the language dimension. How many people are there in Iran who speak good English or speak good enough English they can come over and do this job here? Right? How many Chinese people are there who speak English, speak good enough English? In every single case, right? This game is massively stacked in favor of the anti-American forces, right? And you can't take a white guy and train him to speak Korean and insert him in North Korea, motherfucker. Okay? You can't take a white guy from Boca Raton and get him to become a janitor in a hotel in North Korea. You have to have some way of finding within North Korea someone who ostensibly and on the level is a good, loyal communist, but who deep down in their heart is willing to betray North Korea, subvert and fight against North Korea, and do this for you, right? Ultimately, at the cost of their own life, the lives of their family. All right. That's what we're talking about here. And it hasn't changed in 50 years. Okay. And email and recording telephone conversations and satellites. And, that's what we're talking about. And the quote unquote failure of the CIA is not what the New York Times is reporting. I just feel like these people are completely politically illiterate. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand anything about it. The failure of the CIA is not that people are dying. This has always been a game played, those high stakes, the highest stakes imaginable. Okay. That's more than 100 years. That hasn't changed. That's not going to change. Right. The failure is much more profound. Okay. People are not willing to fight and die for the future of democracy in Afghanistan. White Americans are not willing to fight and die for the future of democracy in Afghanistan. People born and raised in Afghanistan are not willing to fight and die for the future of democracy in Afghanistan. They think the American empire is a fucking joke. There's a demoralizing effect of the last 20 years of warfare. There's an extent to which, institutionally, culturally, and politically, America has been discredited, right? In a way that nobody wants to face up to. Nobody wants to take responsibility for. Nobody can even seemingly conceptualize this, as I've said, in terms of particular decisions made by particular leaders, right? In terms of the consequence of those decisions, in terms of educational change, in terms of the competence of the people involved, and then, more broadly, having a culture, having a culture that can transform Afghanistan into a modern cosmopolitan democracy, right? Having a culture that can change its own future, change the future of the rest of the world. Joe Biden has been asked recently what he's going to do about Taiwan. Taiwan is kind of sort of in a state of constant war with China. And Joe Biden's answer is nothing. Okay. A few months earlier, people were asking Joe Biden what he was going to do about Cuba. And Joe Biden's answer was nothing. What if instead Joe Biden said, I want you to know my wife and I are practicing the Chinese language every night together. We're sitting and learning Chinese. And I've been talking to the ambassador in Taiwan about finding and buying a house for me. And I am so committed to the future of democracy in Taiwan that when my term comes to an end, my wife and I are going to retire in Taiwan. When we need medical care, we're going to go to a hospital in Taiwan. We're going to die of old age in Taiwan. So if China ever invades Taiwan, they will know that they are bombing, they are shooting at literally the house, the retirement home of the President of the United States of America. What if he said that? Let's take it up a notch. What if when he was asked about Cuba, he said, let me tell you how I feel about Cuba. Communism in Cuba is going to be destroyed. It's going to be replaced with democracy. And it's going to happen within my lifetime. And I know that's a fact because my wife and I have been practicing Spanish every night. And I'm going to buy a retirement home. And when this is over, I'm going to move there and I'm going to live there for the rest of my life. My life is going to end in a democratic Cuba where they have elections. So, and I don't care what it takes. It's happening now. And that's going to be my legacy and my accomplishment. And that's how my own life is going to end. And I'm personally committed to it to that extent. I'm going to spend my last years with my pants rolled up, walking in the ocean on a beach in Cuba and reading the newspaper in Spanish. And everyone's going to know that communism is never going to come back because the former president of the United States is. There's a little island south of Turkey called Cyprus. 50 years, nobody wants to do anything. It's a lot like Cuba that way. It's just this conflict that goes on and on and on for 50 years and never gets resolved, and nobody fucking does it. It's a lot like Taiwan that way. It's a conflict that goes on and on for 50 years. And all three are islands too, right? A lot of parallels there. All right. And nobody wants to do anything about it because the United States has had the world's most phony, counterproductive alliance imaginable with Turkey, you know. Now, this one, frankly, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England, because it could be countries other than the United States. What if Joe Biden said, look, let me tell you something. This situation with the Turks conquering and occupying half down of Cyprus, it's going to end. It's going to end now because my wife and I have been studying Greek every night. I'm personally committed. I'm going to retire. My life is going to end. You know, I'm going to buy a house on the north side of Cyprus, and I'm going to live in the reunified democracy of Cyprus. The Cypriot people will have their country back again. They're going to have democracy and something. George W. Bush had no military background. He had no sense of himself as a potential or actual hero. I have been told, I don't know if this is true, but I have been told by different witnesses to history that when he was the governor of Texas, he actually spent most of the time in his office playing video games. They have video game console set up with the TV. That is the kind of claim. So like people who were in his office with him reported this. In some ways, it's very believable. In some ways, it's hard to believe. All right. Back in the year 2001 or 2002, how would things be different today? How much different would everything be if George W. Bush said, look, he had never thought about learning any of these languages before. He had never thought about this part of the world before. He never thought it would be a part of his life. But guess what? Now he and his wife are going to devote the rest of their lives to Afghanistan. That he's bought a house there, that he's learning the language there, and that he knows he's committed to the democratization of Afghanistan working and lasting forever because he's going to put his own life on the line. He's going to transform Afghanistan to such an extent that it is possible for a white American like himself to walk down the street and buy a newspaper and sleep at night, right? That he personally is committed to it. The language, the history, the politics, the culture, that he's going to throw himself into this 110%. That he is in this small way going to be a hero. You know, you call this an unwinnable war. No, it's not. It's the easiest war to win in the history of the world. You're up against men on foot with rifles. The Taliban had no air force. Okay, come on. It's just a joke. And the Taliban also refused to use chemical weapons, and they didn't use nuclear weapons. This is a really unbelievably asymmetrical warfare, right? Okay. You lost because of particular decisions made by particular people, right? How do you motivate Afghan people to be your informants, to be your spies, to work for the CIA when George W. Bush himself doesn't have that level of commitment? When the American people themselves don't have that level of commitment? When the American soldiers at all levels, like elite brass, generals, commanders, down to the benefit, none of them have that commitment. None of them are saying they're going to get married to an Afghan woman and stay in Afghanistan forever. They're going to raise their own children there. They're going to, like, imagine you're committed enough that you're going to, whether your kids are white or black or they're half white, half Afghan, whatever. You say, yeah, I'm committed where I'm going to raise my own children growing up here and going to school here. And George W. Bush says he's so old, it would be his grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Sorry, he was too old to talk about his children, but he's going to have his descendants actually living there, actually committed to that place. Okay? The reason why the CIA can't win, especially now, especially in this phase of the 21st century, is that, okay, the supporters of Xi Jinping, the supporters of the communist regime in China, they believe in the future of China in a way that Americans do not believe in the future of America in a way that Americans do not believe in the future of democracy. And very briefly, I think that problem is the same in France and in Germany and in Belgium and in the Netherlands and in England and in Australia. Okay? There is a commitment to the next 1,000 years of China's history that runs really deep. And people are willing to risk their own lives and do daring things, right, for that 1,000-year future. And it runs so deep that even if they personally dislike the leadership of Xi Jinping, like even if they dislike the person who's in power right now, that's not going to shake them. That's not going to turn them, right? In the same way that the fact that you personally dislike George W. Bush or you personally dislike Donald Trump, right, that might really shake the way you feel about democracy. That might really shake the way you feel about the future of America. And I mean that whether you are American or Swiss, whether you are American or French or English, right? Because those people also have to think about how they feel about the future of America and the future of American democracy, okay? There are a lot of people in Iran, again, whether they are secular or devoutly Muslim, and they believe in the 1,000-year future of Iran. Really, for real. Okay, America is up against enemies. And guys, you have to know Russians. It's not everybody in Russia, but Russian nationalism, again, whether Christian or secular. Oh yeah, there are Russians who believe in the 1,000-year future of Russia. And even if they dislike the guy who's in charge right now, like they are looking at this on a time frame where like, hey, communism came and went, Vladimir Putin's going to come and go, but where they are really deeply committed. And it doesn't matter if they've lived in California for 10 years and they have a better quality of life in California than they would have had if they stayed in Vladivostok. They're aware of that. But their commitment on a deep level, the same way you have Chinese agents in America, right? Their commitment on a deep level is to serve that agenda. So what really matters about the failure of the CIA, that we right now in October, it's not going to last. Right now in October 2021, we're having a brief period when the newspapers and news services are wringing their hands over this, okay? It means a lot more than people think it does. It reflects an underlying weakness in our civilization that cannot be solved by increasing the budget for the CIA, and it also cannot be solved by defunding the CIA. You see where I'm going with this? What's wrong with our police forces cannot be solved by increasing the budget for the police, and it cannot be solved by defunding the police. What's wrong with our healthcare system, broadly speaking? Doctors, nurses, hospitals, everything cannot be solved by increasing the budget. It cannot be solved by decreasing the budget. Right. We have some really hard questions to ask ourselves. And the Chinese, they think they've got the answers. We're up against enemies all around the world who are done with asking those questions. And I feel we are still at the very beginning stages of examining, as we are now sleepwalking through the wreckage left, the consequences left over after the end of what were called the Forever Wars.